This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Whenever we sit down to play a game of D&D and we describe our characters, we almost always focus on just two details, our ancestry and our class. I'm playing a Dwarf Ranger. My guy is a Dragonborn Paladin. I'm an Aasimar Warlock. Sometimes you might throw in a specific subclass like Hexblade or Swashbuckler. That's more true for certain subclasses than it is for others, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the video. But it's always class and ancestry and class. Hell, this is anecdotal, but we even had a player in one of my 4th edition games in college who didn't even really use his character's name for one campaign. He was just Elf Avenger 8 because he was an elf and he was an 8th level Avenger. And it just stuck to the point where we still called him Elf Avenger 8 even when he wasn't 8th level anymore. I think partially that was because it kind of sounded like an old pulp hero name, like Secret Agent X or Operator Number 5. I can't speak for anybody else in that group, but at the time I was reading Incognito by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, so those kinds of pulp hero names were on my mind. But anyway, that's a tangent, and not the last one in this video. Stay tuned to the end, if you want. I'm not your boss. But the point is that it's practically the default for D&D players to list off only their character's ancestry and class, and barely any other details. And at this point, we hardly even question it. But today I'm wondering, what if we did question it? What if we put a lot less emphasis on defining our characters by their class? What if, perhaps, we didn't even tell each other our character classes? What would that look like? This isn't really advice because I haven't actually done this in my own games, but this is something I've kind of always wanted to do, or at the very least it speaks to some particular bugaboos I've got with D&D, and might potentially be a way to address them. So just for fun, let's talk through what this would look like, the pros and the cons, what environment might be perfect for this kind of approach, and which indie RPG might have solved this problem in a completely different way. And it's honestly hilarious that I just called this a problem, because it is just one possible approach to a thing that bothers me personally. But not only might this not bother you at all, but this idea might be actively terrible. But I still think it's going to be interesting to explore what appeals to me about it, how it could work, and where it could go wrong. Basically, today we're just doing a fun one. It's been a pretty frustrating month, so you know what? Let's do a fun one. This video is one of the winners of my Patreon poll from July, which was a 4-way tie, so I'm doing all of them. If you want to vote on future polls, you can do that on my Patreon, but there are also cool rewards as well, like ad-free versions of videos, your name in the credits of my D&D PDFs, submitting ideas for future videos. There's a ton of cool stuff. Heck, for just $3 a month, you can get access to an exclusive Discord channel, you get my D&D PDFs when I make those, you can submit questions for my Q&A videos, there's a Q&A up right now, link in the description, and you get your name in the credits of my video essay channel videos. So if any of this sounds cool to you, go check out the Patreon. Now first, let's talk about why I like the idea of not sharing your character class with the other players at the table. The main reason is because I don't think your character class should necessarily say everything about your character. I think there's an impulse to assume that when I hear your character class, that tells me everything I need to know about your character. And that's not an entirely unfounded idea, as we'll talk about in the second half of this video when we get into the downsides of my cool new idea. But I think the problem with this mentality, that your class is the most important thing I need to know about your character, is that it boils down each class into an archetype that we have a hard time imagining an alternate version of. And we can just look at the cast of Vox Machina as an example of a lot of these archetypes. The Barbarian is the big, strong, dumb character who has tattoos to identify that they're part of a tribe. They wear fur-lined clothing to represent that they come from the wilderness, but they also might wear very little clothing to showcase that they don't fit into typical society. The Bard is the flamboyant performer who isn't as physically imposing, who isn't even known for their fighting ability, but is in fact most famous for being a cunning liar and an incorrigible flirt. The Rogue is the edgy loner assassin with a shady criminal past, and so on, you get the idea. Now, I love the characters from Vox Machina. I think the fact that they're all archetypes allowed the players to flesh them out in more interesting, nuanced ways. But for a lot of these characters, and a lot of D&D characters in general, the moment you hear the name of the class, you have a mental image in your head of what that character is like. And to be clear, this is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. Part of the reason we have preconceptions about rogues and bards is because games like D&D have established these archetypes. I'm not going to pretend that the flirtatious bard doesn't exist in any form outside of the influence of D&D. It is essentially still the stereotype we have about musicians in general, but when you ask D&D players what they imagine a bard to be like, their mental image is often going to be the flirtatious bard, but that mental image is heavily informed by their experiences playing D&D and being a part of this community. And on the other hand, sometimes the reason a D&D class feels so reminiscent of our mental image for these terms is just because of good game design. If you tell a new D&D player that they can play a wizard, then whether they imagine Merlin or Harry Potter, the wizard class does capture that core fantasy. Technically, I think Merlin is typically referred to as a druid in the original legends, but the way he's been depicted in popular media for at least the past century does line up pretty well with the wizard archetype and the way wizards work in D&D. There's a reason the iconic Pathfinder wizard looks like Gandalf, because when you say you can play a wizard, a lot of players are going to want to be Gandalf. They're going to be excited about that. However, the more we stick to these archetypal images, the more restrictive these stereotypes become. And if we, hypothetically, stop describing our characters using their class, it might free up some of us to create more unconventional characters. What sort of D&D character might you create if you're not worried about how they sync up with the lore and conventions in the book? Sure, the player's handbook might tell you that a cleric or a paladin doesn't need to worship a god, but it's still really common for D&D clerics to also be just a typical archetypal priest. But why can't a cleric's patron be a more sinister or mysterious entity like a warlock? Outside of Jester on Critical Role, how often do you see players taking that approach? The same goes for divine characters who don't worship a god at all. That's completely street legal according to the rules of the game, but again, outside of Kingston and Dimension 20's Unsleeping City, how often do players feel free enough from genre conventions to create a character like that? I had a player in one of my campaigns who created a monster hunter type character. He was a brooding loner who traveled the wilderness and wore heavy furs and carried a ton of weapons. I don't know if this is a direct source of inspiration, but if we're talking about archetypes, Geralt from The Witcher was a pretty close match to how we pictured that character. But he wasn't a barbarian or a fighter or a blood hunter, he was a paladin. I think it's really common for us to visualize paladins as basically knights in armor. Even if we don't picture them as the good guy, not necessarily a knight in shining armor, it's still really hard for us to shake the idea that they're always wearing heavy armor and usually operating under some sort of code of ethics, even if it's a skewed one. But this character never referred to himself as a paladin within the world of the game. To the people of the world, he was a monster hunter. He was only really a paladin for the purposes of gameplay. I think this really gets into another topic that I've referenced a few times recently, and this does have a lot to do with how I imagine the world of a D&D setting actually works. Because I've said this before, but I have a really hard time believing that your typical citizen of your D&D world would have a difference in the words they used for a paladin versus a cleric. From the gameplay perspective, the difference is enormously important. They have different mechanics because they're trying to capture different core fantasies. But for the people living in the world, would they necessarily be able to tell that a character is a paladin or a cleric just by seeing them? Or for that matter, could they tell the difference between a paladin and a fighter? Or a barbarian and a fighter? This is one of the issues I have with always identifying our characters by their classes. I don't necessarily believe that someone's character class should be something that anyone within the world can automatically determine the moment they see you. Which is kind of why I wish we put a lot more emphasis on our character's ancestry and background, because I think those are far more useful for determining how a typical member of society is going to view your character at first glance. If I'm running an NPC who is encountering your character for the very first time, I think it's far more interesting and reasonable for them to react to your character based on the fact that they're a hermit, or a noble, or a scholar, or a pirate. All four versions of that character might be a wizard, but should that be the most obvious thing about that character? And still, this might be a topic that I'll have to talk about in more detail another day, because it also gets into the idea of whether or not these character classes have an identity or a role within the world writ large. For example, I think it's a lot easier for us to imagine that wizards are a known quantity in the world because a lot of fantasy fiction has wizards. And I do think that someone like a wizard would know the difference between wizards and warlocks and sorcerers. I think that's a distinction that someone who knows a lot about magic would be able to make. But what about your everyday people? If someone didn't have any magic powers, would they know the difference between those terms? Why would they? Or would they instead have their own definitions based on rumors and folklore and misunderstandings?
A sorcerer is a wizard without a hat. Think about it.
In the world of The Lord of the Rings, rangers are a thing. When somebody references a ranger, everybody more or less knows what they're talking about.
He's one of them rangers. Dangerous folk they are, wandering the wilds. What his right name is, I've never heard, but round here, he's known as Strider.
But is that also true in the Forgotten Realms? Well, okay, maybe that's a bad example. One of the things I famously dislike about the Forgotten Realms, or at least the way it's presented in D&D 5th edition, is this idea that every NPC has class levels. And even if we broaden our scope to the older material that people actually like, the most famous character in the Forgotten Realms is literally a ranger. So, okay, fair enough. Clearly they are a thing. But is that true in a world like Eberron, or in Dark Sun, or in your own homebrew world? If somebody says that they're a ranger, does everybody know what that means? And would all characters we describe as rangers use that character class? Or would some of them be fighters, or druids, or barbarians, or rogues? In a game I played right before the pandemic, a couple of players came into conflict because one of them was playing a College of Whispers bard, but appeared to be a typical puckish performer. That's something that really excited him about that subclass, the fact that College of Whispers bards typically pose as bards of other subclasses. But the party fighter kept asking leading questions because the fighter assumed their character would basically know everything about a bard and all the different colleges, because, well, why wouldn't they? Well, because that's not how I'd visualize the setting, and it didn't line up with how the Bard's player had imagined his character. He wasn't assuming Bard colleges were such a literal part of the world that other characters would know anything about. So the fighter was essentially metagaming to figure out the Bard's secret, but the fighter didn't think they were metagaming, because they assumed this sort of information would be common knowledge. Because it's common knowledge for players, so why would it be any different for our characters? And that was fundamentally just a misalignment of the player's expectations. They weren't on the same page about how people perceived Bards, or I guess probably all character classes, within the world of D&D. But what if instead I had done a good job and established a baseline that everyone could work with? What if I had made it clear that when the characters in the game talk about bards, they're simply talking about performers in the world, like Jaskier from The Witcher or Gavoth from The Name of the Wind? Characters who aren't necessarily magical, they don't have magic powers. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But when player characters or NPCs talk about bards, they essentially mean a troubadour. And I could also make it clear that if someone is playing the bard class, that doesn't necessarily mean that their character is a performer. They could be a mysterious magic user like Gandalf, or a charismatic warrior like Bane. What if I made it clear that not all priests in the world of the game have cleric spells, and not every wandering barbarian has the ability to take half damage from bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage? You could play a barbarian, aka a member of a wandering tribe from the fringes of civilization, and use the stats for a fighter, or a ranger, or a rogue. You could use the barbarian stats for a soldier who shrugs off damage due to years of training their body and their mind, the kind of training we might associate with a monk, using mind over matter to ignore the pain. You could use the monk class to play a character who has no formal martial arts training, but simply has extremely keen reflexes like Spider-Man. Basically, we could just try to remember that the rules of the game are not the same thing as the world of the game. The rules of the game are there to establish a baseline so you can hopefully play any sort of character you want, and they're simply categorized under these helpful blanket terms like fighter, cleric, rogue, etc., to group specific core mechanics together. You could argue about whether 5th edition does that as successfully as another game like Pathfinder might, but I hope that we can at least agree on the core premise that the game designers don't assume that everyone using the barbarian class came from a wandering barbarian tribe, or that every paladin is necessarily a holy warrior. And while this might not necessarily be the philosophy of the people writing these adventures, considering how many important NPCs are described as having D&D classes, I can tell you that I personally really prefer settings where we don't necessarily assume that every NPC also has character class levels. Now, let's be fair, it's hard to establish the cultural norms of your campaign setting. Your players can't see inside your head and know how you imagine each character class might or might not be represented within the world of the game. And the only times where they really get to interact with your setting is for a few hours every week or month or whatever, when they actually sit down to play the game. But of course, that doesn't have to be the case. You could give your players access to your entire setting and your lore, so they can peruse it at their leisure and get a better sense of how you picture the world. And that's easier than ever to do if you use today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that you can use to log all the information about your campaign setting and present that information in these super legible articles, thanks to World Anvil's fantastic templates. You can create articles for monsters, magic items, locations, NPCs, historical events, and honestly, anything you could think of. And on the subject of keeping secrets, World Anvil actually allows you to include information in an article that's only visible for you as the GM, so you can log information that you can come back to whenever you want, but you can still keep it hidden from your players, even if they have access to that article. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that is worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. So we've talked about why this is such an intriguing idea for me, because of how it addresses specific issues I've got with the way some players interface with the world of the game. But now we're going to talk about why this approach might actually be kind of a bad idea. Because to start with the obvious, there are two big reasons why we usually tell each other what class we're playing. The first is that it's really helpful when making characters, so we don't step on each other's toes. I try not to worry too much about making sure that no two players play the same class. After all, I once ran a game for 4 druids, and another campaign when our characters all died in a TPK, we all rolled up bards to play through the rest of the adventure. But that being said, there are plenty of reasons why you might not want anyone to play the same class. Maybe because your group wants to play a more well-rounded party, or maybe you're starting at level 1, and you don't think your characters are going to feel different enough from each other, so people are maybe not going to have as much fun as they could if they all had different unique powers, like they might get if they were all playing different classes. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach to D&D. But the other reason we tell each other our classes is because it helps us understand the mechanical details we need to know about each other's characters. If you're playing a rogue, but I don't know that because you've been reskinned as a wandering warrior, aka a barbarian, well, I might figure that you can handle a couple of foes on your own, because I think you're a barbarian, and I would be wrong about that. And that misunderstanding might lead me to leaving you to fend for yourself in what I don't realize is actually about to be a lethal encounter. If I know you're a rogue, I roughly know what to expect from you in combat. I'll know that you deal more damage if there's an ally next to your opponent, or if you have an advantage on the attack. So if I'm a cleric, I might try to make sure to cast Guiding Bolt on your opponent, so if the spell hits, you'll be able to get advantage on your next attack. On the other hand, if I'm a fighter, I'm more likely to run up alongside you so you can get sneak attack with your next hit because you have an ally adjacent to you. But of course, if I know you're a swashbuckler rogue, I might give you some more space, or try to keep other foes away from you, because I know you do better in one-on-one duels. I think this is why certain subclasses become part of that default description of D&D characters. You don't usually hear people say that they're a light domain cleric or an Oath of the Ancients paladin. It still happens, of course. There are some players who are always going to list off all their things when they describe their characters. But in my personal experience, there are certain subclasses that more players are a lot more likely to include in their brief descriptions. It seems like you're way more likely to hear a rogue say that they're an assassin or a swashbuckler, or to hear a warlock say they're a hexblade, because some subclasses kind of feel like they have to be included because they so dramatically change your mechanics and the way your character works in combat. I also think this is why it's been so uncommon for us to list our backgrounds. We always hear about a character's ancestry and class, but we don't always hear about the background, because your background doesn't tend to have a huge impact on your playstyle. Even your ancestry is expected to have some mechanical bonuses, and potentially also help communicate how your character is perceived, because we also might have some expectation about how an elf or a tiefling acts in society, and how other NPCs would react to them, but that's maybe a topic for another day. But still, the reason backgrounds were revamped in the new version of the game is specifically because players wanted them to have a bigger mechanical impact. So I actually wonder if this might change as more players play the new version of the game. It's very possible that this will make backgrounds feel more relevant, and we'll start hearing them in character loglines more often. It won't just be Elf Ranger, it'll be Elf Ranger Acolyte, because that might actually begin to impact the game. I'm not sure, we'll have to see what happens. But what happens if your fellow players don't have any sense of your character's abilities? Well, if those players are more strategically minded and they want to try to come up with some cool combos so you can all work well together, or if they just want to know what your deal is, then if you don't tell your fellow players what class you are, they might think that you're being needlessly difficult. Matt Colville has a story about playing the Middle-earth role-playing game, and thanks to his really good rolls during character creation, his bard was so good at so many things that he could basically pretend to be almost any other class. So he kept his character sheet face down, and with every encounter, he changed his tactics. So his fellow players didn't know if he was a fighter or a rogue or what his deal was. And most of the players seemed fine with it, but one player in particular was really frustrated because Matt was being difficult. And so while this idea of hiding your character class was fine on paper, no pun intended, in execution, Matt Colville admits that, with the benefit of hindsight, he now realizes he was being a bit of a brat. He wasn't necessarily ruining the fun of the other players, but he was holding it hostage, so the rest of the group had to engage with the game on his terms, because not all of the players knew what he was doing before the campaign began, so they didn't have any opportunity to buy in. So even if I wanted to take this tactic for a spin in one of my games, I'd have to ask everybody how they felt about it in advance, and if one of my players didn't want to do it, we just wouldn't do it. I'd still try to break my players' preconceptions of how the different classes might or might not be represented within the world of the game, like I discussed earlier, and I might even encourage my players to think about their characters as more than just their class, and stress that the everyday citizens probably don't see them as a fighter. They might primarily see them as an elf noble, or a tiefling urchin, or a dwarven sailor. But it might not actually work for my players to literally not tell each other what character classes they're playing. That being said, I also can't help but feel like this approach works a bit better for an audience watching a game, such as, perhaps, an actual play show. Without getting into specific spoilers, there have absolutely been moments where we as an audience are watching or listening to an actual play campaign and the characters are introduced without a logline. Instead of getting dwarf and rogue, we get a more cinematic description of the character. We see the dwarf that has fallen on hard times, down to their last 2 copper pieces and dodging debt collectors. The opening of Campaign 2 of Critical Role did a great job of not establishing the character classes early on. I remember Matt Colville live tweeting that first episode, and when one character used one of his abilities in combat, Matt Colville wondered if that might have been a bard. But that wasn't the case. The character was actually a blood hunter. But there was a bit of mystery to it, and that was kind of cool because it meant that we, as the audience, were getting to know these characters through their personalities and their interactions with each other. Now, it's possible some of the players actually didn't know each other's character classes when they sat down to play the game, because, like a lot of groups, they all created their characters separately, and then a few played together in some brief games before they broadcasted their first session, but none of those mini-games were with the full group. So some of them legitimately might have still been in the dark. And once they did figure out each other's classes, there wasn't that same sense that I was talking about where the people of the world wouldn't use these terms the way we use them to describe character classes. It wasn't long before the characters had a debate over whether it's reasonable to expect Jester to heal the other characters because she's the cleric. And first of all, it's a very funny scene, but also, it's fine for the players to still use that kind of language to describe their characters because it didn't seem like a big deal to Matt if they do think of their characters and the other NPCs in terms of character classes. I mean, that's especially true given how often Matt uses player character classes for his villains and NPCs. But even without those elements in play, even if all the players still knew each other's character classes before they started playing, it might still be kind of fun to not share those with the audience and just let the viewers enjoy these characters as characters and maybe have a bit of fun figuring out their mechanics. But as you've probably noticed, part of the reason this idea appeals to me so much is because I think character classes are given too much importance when describing our characters to each other, specifically because I don't think a class says very much about how the people of the world view your character. But that doesn't have to be the case. What if there was a game where the player character class did have implications for how the people of the world regarded you? And this is where I get to talk about Shadowdark, an indie RPG that draws a lot of inspiration from the design of 5th edition, but does so in service of recreating the dread players felt in old school games of D&D. It's a really excellent entry into the OSR, the old school renaissance, where people basically just wish the game worked a bit more like D&D worked back in the day, where everybody didn't have dark vision and death was around every corner. And one thing I love about Shadowdark is the fact that every class has a chart of level titles. Like a lot of OSR games, there are only a couple of classes in the core book. In Shadowdark, there's the Fighter, the thief, the priest, and the wizard. There have been a few other classes created as well, usually in the Cursed Scroll zines or as free downloads, but the goal isn't to give you a ton of classes, it's to make sure that any new class actually adds something to your experience. So already we have an approach that I like, where there really wouldn't be any distinction between a barbarian and a fighter, or a cleric and a paladin, in the eyes of everyday townspeople. However, the reason I like that approach is because there is no meaningful difference in the world of D&D, only in the rules. So it makes sense that the everyday people don't know these specific terms. However, in Shadowdark, there's a very different approach. It stops doing the thing that I like in service of specificity, and winds up doing something that I really wasn't expecting, but that I love. See, as you level up, you gain notoriety, and different terms begin to become associated with you as you move through the world. But these titles are also influenced by your alignment. A lawful level 3 priest who comes into town is known as a crusader, but a neutral level 3 priest is an invoker, and a chaotic level 3 priest is a zealot. Now suddenly we've got some world building here. We're being told that, actually, yes, it does matter. A paladin in Shadowdark is not a separate class, it's actually the level title for a 9th or 10th level lawful priest. That's as high level as you can get. But a chaotic priest of the same level is a chaos knight, and the neutral counterpart is an oracle. And there's no mechanical differences. There's nothing on your character sheet that specifically distinguishes the abilities of a priest depending on what alignment they are. But the game still insists that the common people do have different terms for the different types of priests, but not based on their abilities or on whether or not they get Divine Smite versus Divine Intervention or whether or not they can summon a horse. Instead, the difference is, you have a reputation. Shadowdark has a wizard class, but Warlock and Sorcerer are chaotic level titles for the wizard, whereas the Druid is a neutral level title for the wizard. And in the eyes of the common people, this has nothing to do with whether or not you get your magic from years of tedious study, or from a contract with an eldritch being, or from a mysterious ancestor, or from the power of the elements themselves. The game doesn't work that way. Instead, these different titles are based entirely upon one thing: your character's reputation. When an NPC identifies a lawful fighter as a squire, or a cavalier, or a knight, or a thane, or a lord/lady, they're technically referring to your level. But in the world of the game, that means they're recognizing your prowess in battle, and your influence in the world. But when they can also tell the difference between a lord/lady and a warlord, that's them recognizing that your character is either lawful or chaotic. And so not only does that make your choice of alignment feel more relevant, which is always tricky when it comes to alignment, but they're also saying that the people know who you are, and what you are, by the way you carry yourself, or through rumors and legends they've heard about you. And it might surprise you to hear that I like this approach, since it is literally the opposite of the philosophy I've been advocating for most of this video. But essentially, all I want is for us to put some thought into whether or not the people of the world would have any frame of reference for the terms we use to describe our characters. In D&D, with a couple of exceptions, I don't see a strong reason for that to be the case. I don't know how it enhances the story for the common people to have a different language for describing clerics versus paladins, because that difference feels arbitrary to me, and making them distinct within the world of the game just feels artificial. But in Shadowdark, it does feel like there's a reason for the characters to use different terms, because it represents your growing status and helps keep your alignment in play throughout the campaign. Thanks so much for watching. This is a bit of a strange video because I don't really know if there's any advice in it, but this is more of a subject that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I just really wanted to talk it through and see what it would look like if we were going to try to implement this in your game. What are the pros and cons of this approach? And more importantly, I want to try to figure out why this idea is so appealing to me. And of course, it just wound up making me really excited to play Shadowdark again, which I'm really hoping to do in the new year. It has been so hard for me to carve out any time ever since my baby was born, especially as I shuffle my office around the different rooms in the house. But I am really genuinely hoping I can get some more games into my schedule after the new year, and that includes 5th edition and Shadowdark and Pathfinder, and hopefully some more new games like Daggerheart and Draw Steel. It's a really exciting time for TTRPGs, and I am really looking forward to having more thoughts about a lot of new games. And if you want to make sure you stay up to date with everything I have to say, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you want to help support the channel, you can do that via Patreon. You can also hang out with other people in my Discord server, and you can catch all of my updates whenever I send them out, not very often, by signing up for my newsletter. All those links are in the doobly-doo below. Also, I briefly want to talk about, this has nothing to do with anything, you can stop watching, but I have to get this off my chest. I briefly want to talk about that clip I played from The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. It's a very useful clip to help articulate my point, but the scene also doesn't make any sense, because it starts with this exchange.
So I have a feeling they might be a part of the big three.
What big three?
The big three.
What big three?
Androids, aliens, and wizards.
That's not a thing.
That's definitely a thing.
No, it's not.
Every time we fight one of the three.
So who are you fighting now, Gandalf?
And I guess we could consider Loki a wizard, although he's also an alien, but also Thanos was essentially an alien wizard, so whatever. They do fight those three things. Fair enough. But Sam, you guys also fight a lot of Nazis. You fought Hydra in Washington, D.C., and then the Avengers fought Hydra in Sokovia, and then you and the rest of the Avengers chased down a Hydra agent in Lagos at the beginning of Civil War. You and the other Avengers have fought Nazis a bunch of times, and the Avengers have only fought androids once. And I don't know, it just feels like kind of a glaring omission. Sam, you should include the fact that you guys fight a lot of Nazis. Be proud of that. It's good to fight Nazis. And it's bad to elect a Nazi as the president. And I know everyone you don't like is a Nazi. Just because you don't like him doesn't mean he's Hitler. Fair enough. But the fact that he says immigrants poison the blood of our country does kind of make him Hitler. And when people pointed out to him that it made him sound like Hitler because it's pretty close to how Hitler used to talk, Trump did say that Hitler said it differently than him. Weird response. And then he just kept saying the stuff because he either didn't care that his rhetoric made him sound like Hitler, or he kind of likes that his rhetoric makes him sound like Hitler. And either way, that does a little bit make him Hitler. And also the fact that he said he wishes he had Hitler's generals because they were so loyal, despite the fact that a bunch of Hitler's generals tried to kill him, that also does a little bit make him Hitler. And apparently whenever John Walter, not to be confused with John Walker from Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but whenever John Walter, an employee from the Trump organization, would visit Trump in his office, he would click his heels and say, "Heil Hitler." You know, as a joke he did regularly. And Trump apparently didn't respond by saying, "Hey, what the fuck, don't do that, that's a fucked up thing to do." And also, Trump used to have a book of Hitler's speeches in a cabinet next to his bed. And when he was asked about it by a journalist, he paused and then said, "Who told you that?" Which is a very good and normal reply. Then he said, "No, actually, I don't have a book of Hitler's speeches. A friend did give me a copy of Mein Kampf, but it's okay because he's Jewish." And then the reporter asked that friend about it, and he said, "No, it wasn't Mein Kampf, it actually was a book of Hitler's speeches. I thought Trump would think it was interesting, and also I'm not Jewish." And then Trump told the reporter, "If I had those speeches, and I'm not saying I do, I would never read them." And Ivana Trump made it clear that Trump isn't a reader or a history buff, which, don't worry, we didn't need to be told that. So the reporter just speculated that maybe Trump was perhaps just interested in Hitler's skill with propaganda. But you know, when looking at that story within the context of those other stories I mentioned, I don't know, it does kind of sound like maybe he just likes Hitler stuff? Or at the very least, he's the type of person that someone might think, hey, he might think this book of Hitler's speeches is interesting, so I'm going to give it to him as a gift. And then Trump apparently is also the type of person who wouldn't immediately respond by saying, hey, that's a weird and fucked up thing to do, and then promptly decline the gift. Nor is the type of person who will instead just politely thank the gift giver for the Nazi book and then privately throw the book away as soon as they're gone. And I guess I've never really given it a lot of thought before now, but now that we're on the subject, I'm actually very proud to have cultivated both the image and the friend group where nobody's ever thought to give me a book of Hitler's speeches, or his memoir, because nobody thought I'd be into it. But anyway, very cool that he's about to be the president again, and that the Supreme Court said nothing he does on the job this time can be considered a crime. This should go great. Anyway, get ready for a seamless segue, because now that we've talked about a few real-world villains, you should check out a video I made about fictional villains. It's actually tied into this video, not the Nazi stuff we just talked about, but the idea of whether or not your D&D villains should have class levels. You should check that video out right here. It's a great video. Until next time, play fair and have fun.